Well, good evening. Good to see everybody tonight. You have a Bible? Let's go to the book of Proverbs tonight. Proverbs chapter 14 is where we're going to spend our time tonight. Proverbs 14, also Proverbs 16. We're going to look at twin verses out of this great Old Testament book. And while you're opening your Bible and getting settled, we welcome all of you. Thanks for being here tonight. You are hardy souls, let me tell you, to get out and brave the elements tonight. We appreciate you doing that. Appreciate you making your way to be with us and for the encouragement that you give us by being here tonight. I appreciate you trying to make me feel at home, but you did not have to make me feel like when I lived in Indiana. It would have been okay to bypass that. I tell you, last night we were at the Roberts and Ed and Teresa were there, and I was telling them that when we moved from Plainfield, Indiana to Temple Terrace, Florida, we moved on December the 28th, 1993, and we moved in a blizzard. They packed up our house and the movers came, and it was absolutely a blizzard that we moved in. And when we arrived in Temple Terrace, Florida, it was New Year's Eve, December the 31st, 3 days later. We got out of the van and it was 72 degrees. And I looked at my wife, Vicki, and I said, "The Lord has called me to Florida." And I have been obedient to that call for 26 years now. And after today, if I live another 26, I'm going to be obedient to that call. But it's wonderful to be with you tonight. And thank you for braving the elements, and thank you for the encouragement that you give us by being here. We are, as was mentioned a moment ago, we're talking this week, these 4 days, about being heaven-bound. This is a theme that we have pursued in our church family at Temple Terrace in 2019, about being heaven-bound. And we have divided that into 4 quarters of various kinds of study, one of which had to do with some of the things that get us off track as we try to make our way from earth to heaven and obtaining that goal. And that's really what we want to talk about for just a few minutes tonight, as you can see as we talk about the statement in the Bible that there is a way that seems right to a man. I want to tell you about a character from history that many of you will recognize. His name was Douglas Corrigan, and he was an aviator, a skilled aviator in an age of aviation pioneers. He lived in an age of Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh and Howard Hughes, and it was a time of great aviation records. It was a time of people setting records about the fastest across the United States, and then the fastest nonstop across the ocean, and then flying solo across the ocean. But no matter what Mr. Corrigan did and what record he established, it seemed like he was always a day late. Somebody was always ahead of him, just a bit. And so he flew across the country, California to New York, and he set a speed record. And he knew that he was going to get some acclaim for that, but at the same time, Howard Hughes was flying around the world. And Mr. Hughes came home, and he got a ticker tape parade in New York City, and he got a black tie dinner with all the movers and shakers of the United States, and Mr. Corrigan, once again, was just completely overlooked. So he wanted to fly across the ocean, across the Atlantic. But to do that, you had to have a special permit from the FAA, and he applied 3 times for it, and 3 times he was denied because his plane literally was held together with baling wire and chewing gum, and so they just kept denying him. So when he set that speed record from California to New York, he refueled his plane, and he took off. He took off for California. And 28 hours later, he landed, not in California, but in Ireland. In Ireland. And he claimed that he had flown above the clouds, that he had no landmarks that he could see, and that his compass wasn't working right, and that he accidentally went the wrong way. Well, the federal government didn't buy that at all. They believed that he had done that on purpose, but he claimed until the day that he died in 1995, he claimed that he had just accidentally gone the wrong way. And that's why we know him not as Douglas Corrigan, but we know him as Wrong Way Corrigan. And you can see this headline in the New York Post that's backwards to try to commemorate what he did. Wrong Way Corrigan. You know, there's a verse in our Bible that's repeated verbatim twice. Proverbs 14 and verse 12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. It has a twin verse in 16:25 again. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. There's a way that seems right. There's a way that seems right. But Solomon says, in fact, it is not right. In fact, not only is it the wrong way, but it's the worst way because ultimately it leads to death. Solomon would talk about that, for example, to his son. Early in this book, in Proverbs chapter 7, Solomon is talking to his son. And he talks to his son about the fact that he was looking out the window and he saw a young man who confused lust for love and sex for intimacy. And he ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. And he ended up dead at the hands of a jealous husband. There was a way that seemed right to him, but in the end, it was the way of death. How many times have we seen trouble coming in someone else's life, where they're living their life and they're going along and they think everything is just fine, and yet as an outsider, you looking at their life, you realize things are not fine at all. This is not going to end up well for them. How many times have you seen a married couple and you notice that they are spending very, very little time together, and the husband maybe is consumed with work, and the wife maybe is consumed with work, or maybe social media, and when they are together, they don't get along very well at all, and you can just tell this is not going to end well. It may seem to them that everything's okay, but you know this is not going to end up well at all. How many times have you seen a young person who begins dating and becomes infatuated with somebody who isn't a Christian? They don't share their faith, they don't share their values at all. And so you begin to notice that that young person begins to question things that they have always held sacred. And maybe they are not worshiping as faithfully as they once did, or they begin to rebel against their mom and dad in some way. And you just know this is not going to end well. And it may seem to that young person that everything is fine and everything is good, but you know that that's a way that is not going to go well at all. And those examples can be replicated over and over and over again. Two very simple thoughts tonight. First, why does the wrong way so often to us seem right? And it does, doesn't it? I mean, but all of us would have to acknowledge that. And second, if everybody else can see that we are often headed in the wrong way, why can't we? Why is it so hard to see that? And it is, isn't it? We are often blinded to our own situations. Why can't we see situations before it's too late? Why does it take a divorce or a bankruptcy or an arrest or a withdrawal of fellowship before we see that we are going in the wrong direction? Why does it take individuals becoming broke or friendless or hopeless, or maybe like the prodigal, finding themselves living in a situation that in their mind's eye they could never even imagine that they would be, and yet there they are? Why does it take that sometimes before individuals come to their senses? And for some, the realization comes too late. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, that there are some things that are very difficult, if not impossible, to repair. Everything has a tipping point. And we can reach a point where, as Solomon said, there's a way that seems right, but if we're not careful, we end up, and it's a way of death, and we get so far toward that edge that we've reached the tipping point, and there's no real coming back. And again, we've all seen that. How many families have we seen that have been just torn apart by drugs or divorce? Or how many reputations have we seen that have been ruined by dishonesty or maybe immorality? The Bible is full of examples like that, right? And so we look at Eve. We look at Eve talking to a serpent, and David looking at Bathsheba, and Lot's wife turning back toward Sodom, and Nadab and Abihu offering an unauthorized worship to God, and Ananias and Sapphira choosing to lie to an apostle. All of those were terribly wrong. And we look at that, and we clearly see that. I mean, if we could interject into the biblical text, we would look at those stories, and if we could speak to those stories, we would say, Eve, don't talk to the serpent. David, don't look. Nadab and Abihu, don't offer that. Ananias and Sapphira, don't lie. We easily see those things. But in our own life, how many times have we spent time with the serpent? How many times have we looked when we shouldn't and not followed God's pattern that we understood clearly? How many times have we lied to protect ourselves? If you're taking notes tonight on the little handout that you picked up when you came in, I just want to talk about two things tonight. Tonight's lesson is extraordinarily simple. I just want to ask two very simple questions tonight, and then the lesson will be yours. Here they are. Question number one: why can't we see? There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Why can't we see that? Why is that such a challenge? There is a way that seems right, Well, why can't we see that it's not? That eventually it's going to eventuate in death? Well, I think there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. One is because we become disoriented. That's exactly what Solomon said. There's a way that seems right. We just had the anniversary back in August of, you remember the story from 20 years ago, this summer, of Robert Kennedy Jr. and his wife when he was flying and he became disoriented at night and they lost their lives. He became disoriented and he lost his way and lost his life. Why is that? Why do we become disoriented? Well, I think because sometimes the way that we're on, it makes sense to us. It makes sense to us. There are a lot of things that make sense to us that really can do us harm, aren't there? I mean, it makes sense to us that I should be able to do whatever it is that makes me happy. It makes sense to us that we, if we need to, should be able to lie to get ourselves, to extricate ourselves from trouble. It makes sense to us that church should just be fun. Church should be fun and games. We really shouldn't have all the rules and regulations that God gives us. It makes sense to me that I'm just the way I am. This is the way God created me. And if God created me to be a racist or homosexual or selfish or dishonest, that's the way God created me, and that's just who I am, and I should be okay with that, and you should be okay with that, because that's what makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that we should all be able to find our own God. It makes sense to me that the bumper sticker should be right, that we should all just coexist. Whatever your faith is, whatever your belief is, whoever your God is, we should all be able to just coexist. Or in the words of the great theologian Taylor Swift, we just all need to calm down. Just calm down, accept each other, and get along, because that makes sense. And I tell you what makes sense to us, that the Bible should change with the times a little bit. Because after all, everything else changes. Laws change, culture change, you change, I change. Why can't the Bible change to fit us as well? That makes sense to me. Well, that's where we get into a lot of trouble spiritually, isn't it? And then beyond that, there are just so many other people who see it that way. And that's a real challenge, isn't it? Because so often it seems right because so many others are doing the same thing. And so it's kind of like reading one of those 5-star reviews on Amazon where 2,000 people have chimed in, and you think, well, how in the world could this many people be wrong? And I think we look at things, particularly in our culture, and wonder about that. I think our young people are particularly challenged about that. I mean, do you realize, ladies and gentlemen, our young people, our teenagers today are the first culture in American history to live in a society, in a culture, in a world that says things like homosexuality and gay marriage are just fine. They're the first young people that are growing up in a culture where the culture says this is okay. Even in ancient pagan Roman culture, where homosexuality was common, they never considered that to be marriage when two were together, ever. We've gone far beyond that in America. And if we're not careful, our young people will look and say, well, if this is what everybody believes, how in the world could this possibly be wrong? And then sometimes the challenge is that we just want it to be right. It's what we want to do, and so we want it to be right. And if others are doing it, well, that validates it in my mind even more. And so this makes sense to me. Now, I tell you what brings us back to our senses about that, of course, is a passage like Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, where God says, look, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my thoughts than your thoughts, and my ways than your ways. In other words, God is saying, I think if we could read between the lines, God is saying, look, you may not fully understand. And I have to acknowledge that. I may not always understand God's rationale about some things, but it doesn't mean that I'm right and God's wrong. And so I may not fully understand why baptism is necessary to salvation. I may not fully understand why God provided only one cause, immorality, adultery, for divorce and remarriage. I may not understand why God is so concerned about my character or my integrity or my heart or my influence. But I tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to tell God that I know better than him, because he's God and I'm not. And so we become disoriented. Sometimes I think we become desensitized. Sometimes we become desensitized. That is, we don't feel the same about particularly sin as maybe generations before, maybe even as we did in the past. The concept of sin is an interesting one because it's almost been eradicated from American culture. even in religion. In the reading that I do that comes from greater modern evangelical thought, you rarely read or hear the word sin anymore. And so what I read often in evangelical writings are things like this. Let's confess our struggle with human relational dynamics. Well, that's not very specific, is it? Or something like this. Let's target holiness as a growth objective. Well, I'm not sure that's a growth objective as much as that's an absolute given us of God. But to say, let's deal with the reality of our sin, that's another matter. You don't hear that much in American culture anymore. Why is that? Why is that? Well, I think probably because in the Bible, sin is inextricably tied to judgment. Judgment of ourselves as people who understand that we have missed the mark and fallen short of the glory of God, and judgment sometimes by others with whom we so desperately want to be accepted, and judgment by a holy God whom the prophet Habakkuk said is of purer eyes than to behold our iniquitous deeds. How is it that we become desensitized to something as fundamental as sin? I mean, we understand the Bible tells the truth when it says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. How do we become desensitized to that? Well, I think in three ways. Number one is because of familiarity. Familiarity. You know, how many times have you heard the illustration in sermons or a Bible class that how many times have you heard this? You walk into a movie theater after the movie started and it's already dark, and you go in and you can't see anything, right? But you wait just 2 or 3 minutes, and what happens? Well, your eyes acclimate to the darkness and you become accustomed to the darkness. We've all heard that illustration. And could it be that sometimes we become so accustomed to living in a dark world that we get used to the darkness? Could it be that the vulgarity that we hear on such a regular basis in so many venues and places in the world, or maybe the immorality that we witness sometimes in the media, sometimes in our entertainment, that it just doesn't bother us anymore? We've just kind of become immune to that in some way. We have this little cliche that says familiarity breeds contempt, but not always. Sometimes familiarity just breeds indifference, where we just get used to things. And I think secondly, euphemisms. Euphemisms desensitize us to what things are. In our politically correct culture, we've given our sins respectable names. And what I mean by that is that we've sanded off the sharp edges of some things the Bible says. And we've kind of smoothed some of that down a little bit. And so we give our sins names that mitigate our responsibility. And there are a couple of words that we've appended to a lot of things that the Bible would speak of in much different language, I think. For example, we use the word adult a lot in America. We use the word adult a lot. And so fornication becomes just an adult relationship. And pornography is just adult entertainment. And profanity is just adult language. And we use the word alternative. And so homosexuality is just an alternative lifestyle. And lying is just alternative facts. And by using that kind of language, we take the edge off of some terminology that the Bible uses that is no longer, at least in American culture, politically correct. And I tell you, we do that with humor. That is by laughing. I think that television and movies break down our sensibilities. And you know what they do, ladies and gentlemen? They make us laugh at things that make God cry. Television and the movies are adept at making Christians laugh at the very things that make God cry. And once we do that, once we've taken that step, once we've crossed that line, we become a little more desensitized to the behavior that God says is out of bounds. And then third, and we'll move on from this, and that is we become naive. And sometimes we can't see just because we become naive. That is, we just don't pay attention to the warnings of God. We believe that somehow the warnings don't apply to us. Do you remember hearing on the news, this was back in the spring. Back in the spring this year, there were 4 people who fell to their deaths at the Grand Canyon within a 1-week period. There was an engaged couple and then 2 individuals 4 people fell to their death at the Grand Canyon within a 1-week period. How in the world does that happen? Well, it happened because they were all 4 taking selfies, and they were taking selfies in an area beyond where there were warning signs that said, don't go beyond here. Just don't go beyond here. And all 4 of them did, turned around, took selfies, stumbled, fell. All 4 of them died. And it happened because they ignored the warnings, got close to the edge, and there was a way that seemed right to them, but the end, literally for them, was a way of death. And could I just say, ladies and gentlemen, we become naive when we believe that the warnings don't apply to us. We've all known people like that, who just look with absolute disdain at other individuals, at what they do in their own lives, and yet they exclude it in their own. They allow in themselves what they condemn in others, and they believe somehow that the warnings don't apply to them. There's an interesting phrase in the New Testament that's used 3 times, and 3 times only, and it's the phrase translated in English, don't be deceived. Be not deceived, don't be deceived. We would say, I think, don't fool yourself. But in the New King James Bible that I use, it's don't be deceived. It's only used 3 times in the New Testament. And I want you to look at these with me. Don't be deceived, bad company corrupts good character. Don't be deceived, bad company will destroy good character. And Paul's saying, look, don't fool yourself. Don't think you're a special case. Your friends are going to profoundly impact who and what you are spiritually and where you spend eternity. And if you think your friends are not going to impact you in some way, you're wrong about that. Solomon said, Proverbs 13 and verse 30, walk with the wise and you'll be wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm. Newer translations say the companion of fools comes to destruction. And Paul just says, look, don't fool yourself about that. Don't think you're a special case. Don't think that the people that you spend your time with, and in particular, the person you marry, don't think that they're not going to have an impact on where you spend eternity. Here's the second use of the phrase. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever an individual sows, that he will also reap. And Paul just says, look, don't fool yourself into thinking that this principle doesn't apply to you. It is as true as gravity. None of us worry that we're going to float away because we know the principle of gravity, it's true for you and it's true for me equally, right? And that's what Paul says here. He says, look, don't fool yourself into thinking that you're a special case. The fact of the matter is, you will reap what you sow. You will reap what you sow. And you can try to justify yourself by saying, look, I'm in control of my life, or I can quit anytime I want, or whatever means you want to use to try to mitigate your responsibility. But Paul says, don't fool yourself into thinking that you will not reap what you sow, and what you reap may be extraordinarily painful. And here's the third use. And this comes out of 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9, where he says, don't you know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? He said, don't be deceived. And then he begins to talk about all these kind of behaviors. And he says, nobody who does these things is going to heaven. And he says, don't fool yourself into thinking that your actions have no consequences, or that God is just going to turn a blind eye. And Paul says, look, if you're thinking that you can behave however you want, and because you've been baptized at some point in time in the past, that somehow God's going to say, you know what, it's all okay. He said, don't fool yourself. If we were to extrapolate from that a little bit, maybe he would say, look, don't fool yourself into thinking that because you were baptized at some point in your past, that you can behave like this. You can be a fornicator, or you can worship yourself, or become an adulterer, or behave in some kind of immorality. And that because you were baptized in the past, so that at your funeral, some preacher is going to say that everything's all right with you because of what you did in the past in your baptism, regardless of how you live, that now you died, you're going to heaven. Paul says, don't fool yourself into thinking that. It's just not going to work that way. So why can't we see? Well, we become naive, and we become desensitized. So, before we stop tonight, let's just ask this question. How can we see? How can we see? In our fellowship in Churches of Christ, we have sung for generations a song that says, open our eyes, Lord. We want to see Jesus. That's a great song. And I believe that when we sing that, we mean that we want our eyes open, and we want to be conformed to the image of God's dear Son, And so we want to see him, like those individuals who came to Philip and said, sirs, we would see Jesus. I think that's us. I believe we mean that. But the problem sometimes is that we may not realize that our vision is as bad as it sometimes is. And I'm sure it's true in this congregation, just like it is at Temple Terrace. We've had a lot of folks in our congregation who've had that cataract removal surgery. You know, they go in and have that. And to a person, they all say that when they go back the next day and they take the patch off, they can't believe how well they can see. They say it's just like night and day. Now, I've never had that, but I wear glasses like a lot of you, you know. And I remember the first pair of glasses I got. I was in college. I was down at Florida College, and I got to noticing that I couldn't read the blackboard. Now, you young people, you don't know what a blackboard is, but it's kind of like PowerPoint for old people. And so I went and I got my first pair of glasses, and I remember when they put them on, the optometrist said, "Step outside here." And I stepped outside, and it was like a Disney movie. It was a whole new world that I had not been seeing. And even now, when I get a new pair of glasses, you know, they tell you, go get your eyes checked every year, you know. And so every 5 years I do that. And when I get those new glasses, every time I put them on, I think, wow, I can't believe how much better I can see. Could it be, ladies and gentlemen, that sometimes spiritually we just don't realize that maybe we're not seeing things quite as clearly as we perhaps should? We're not going to take the time to read this passage tonight. It's a lengthy passage, and so I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version of it real quickly here. In 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul is talking about what happens when we die, and he segues out of that. He ends that with saying, comfort one another with these words, and he segues out of that into chapter 5, and he talks about, he gives about 12 bullet points, and he says, you know, if you'll just do these 12 things, it'll really help you keep your focus and have clear vision in this life. And he does that by way of a contrast. And so he contrasts two ways of living. And he says, for example, that a Christian is informed and a non-Christian, a person of the world, is uninformed. And he said a Christian is a believer, but a person of the world disbelieves. That is, they don't have any anchor for their life, nothing that they have anchored their life to. And he said a Christian is prepared. If the Lord comes back today, it's all right. We can say Maranatha, even so, come Lord Jesus. Lord, come back today. I'm fine with that. I'm good with that, aren't you? But a person of the world, they don't want that to happen, because this world is all that they really have. And so Paul would argue that a Christian anticipates eternal salvation, but a person of the world, they don't know what to anticipate. Whether it's, you know, they hope, I think, that it's just annihilation, or maybe that God's just going to accept everybody. But in their heart of hearts, they've got to know, because God put eternity in our hearts, Ecclesiastes 3:11, that may not work out very well for them. And then Paul just says, you know, a Christian is a person of the day. And he contrasts that with a person of the world and says, you know, they're a person of the night, day and night. And even a non-religion person understands the concepts of day and night. But here's what I want you to see about that tonight. That Paul didn't write that. Paul didn't write that passage because he was boasting. You know, he didn't write that passage and say, look, I know a secret. I know a secret that everybody in the world doesn't, and here's what it is. And he wasn't saying that I'm better than you. He wasn't puffing out his chest and saying, you know, I'm better than people in the world, and so let me show you why. That's not what he's doing in that at all. You know what he's doing that, ladies and gentlemen? He's trying to warn us a little bit. Those 12 bullet points that he gives are all designed to say to Christians, to you and me, this will help you. This will help you see how to live. If Paul was a driver's ed teacher, in this passage he's saying, put your hands at 10 and 2, don't text and drive, pay attention to what's going on, put on your seatbelt. If Paul were a meteorologist in this passage, he might be saying, look, there's a storm on the horizon, there may be some tornado warnings, and so when the sirens go off, pay attention to that, be ready to take action to be safe. But he's not a driver's ed teacher, and he's not a meteorologist. He's an apostle, and he's talking about spiritual things. And what he's saying is echoing what Solomon said. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. And so he's saying, look, don't be naive about the dangers to your soul. Understand the consequences of your action. And don't be careless and blind as to what's going on around you. You want to be informed and be a person of faith, prepared, looking to salvation. Be a person of day. In that passage, he says several things, but there are four. If you're taking notes, let me just give these to you really quickly. There are four that I think are particularly salient to us as we think about, again, trying to navigate our way from earth to heaven. Four that are true for everybody. Number one, he says you need to always pray. Pray without ceasing. That's an interesting phrase to me. That doesn't mean every time I teach this passage in a Bible class, I always ask, what does that mean? Pray without ceasing. And somebody almost always raises their hand and says, well, that means that we should be in an attitude of prayer. I don't know what an attitude of prayer is, but that's not the answer. He's saying that prayer needs to be a constant part of your life. That it's just natural to you to pray. Whether those are closet prayers where you're spending an awful lot of time with God and you're communing with God in your closet on a long-term basis, or whether it's like Daniel who just shoots an arrow prayer to God, it's just part of who you are. It's just natural to you. Because communication with home is important. And when I travel, I talk to home all the time because I want to go back home. It makes sense that a Christian would communicate with home. And then secondly, he says, always discern. Test everything, Paul says. That's great advice, isn't it? That's great counsel. Test everything. We do that with things. It's interesting to me. You go to the grocery store, and if you look in the aisles, there are people, and they'll have an item up there, and they've got it turned over to the back, and they've got that list out there, on the back of all the ingredients, and they're looking at all that. And they're seeing how this product, if I ingest this, is going to affect me in some way. We read labels. We look at expiration dates on products. Sometimes, if you've had something in your fridge for a long time, you'll open the cap and you take a sniff because you don't want to put something in your body that doesn't belong there. And Paul says you need to do some discerning spiritually as well. In fact, look at this passage down to 2 Corinthians 13 and 5. Examine yourselves, he said, whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Don't you know that Christ is in you unless, of course, you fail that test? There's a way that seems right to a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. And so it takes some honesty to discern, always discern. And then the other half of that is always keep some things. Test everything. Test all things. And hold on to what's good. Not everything is worth being held on to. And so test everything and use some judgment, some discernment. And hold on to what's really good. Paul said to his young protege, Timothy, take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them. If you'll continue in them, you'll save yourself, and also you'll do good for others. You'll help save others also. But the only way you can do that is if you test everything and hold on to what you know is good. And there's one other thing that he said, and that is that there are some things that you need to always avoid. Abstain from every form of evil. There's a way that seems right to a man, but it ends there with the ways of death. And so that means that we're going to have to test everything, hold on to what's good. And whatever you've decided is evil, don't hold on to it. Don't keep it on life support. Don't keep it close to you in case you want to go back to it. The Bible uses that phrase, those things have to be put to death. It uses that phrase over and over. Put to death, those kinds of things. It doesn't say put them on life support in case you decide you want to resurrect it and involve yourself with it again. It says put it to death and bury it. The point of all that, ladies and gentlemen, is the point of everything that we have said tonight, as we said yesterday morning, is that nobody stumbles their way into heaven by accident. If we are heaven bound, we said yesterday morning, it means that we understand that there is a destination, something for which we are striving. And secondly, it's a journey, it's a process, and it is a mindful one. Again, nobody stumbles their way into heaven by accident. So we began tonight by telling you about Wrong Way Corrigan. There's another famous wrong way person in history. His name was Roy Riegels. Now, that's probably not a name that you would recognize. But Roy Riegels played defense for the Cal football team in the Rose Bowl in 1929, 90 years ago. And if you watch the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day, they show this picture every single year, without exception. So Roy Riegels was playing for Cal on defense, and they were playing Georgia Tech, and Georgia Tech fumbled, and Roy Riegels picked up the ball, and he got disoriented, and he began to run in the wrong direction, and he ran 70 yards in the wrong direction. And his teammates were yelling at him, screaming at him, they were chasing him, and they tackled him at the 2-yard line before he scored, before he scored for the other team. What was interesting about that story to me is that the Georgia Tech players, they were excited too. And so they were yelling at him as well, but they were cheering for him. And the Georgia Tech coach yelled at his players and said, "Sit down, sit down. Every step he takes is to our advantage." I've thought about that. Every step he takes is to our advantage. We said a moment ago that nobody stumbles their way into heaven. Every step you take leads you either closer to heaven or further away from your God. Every step. No wonder Solomon said, "There's a way that seems right to a man, but the ends thereof, the ways of death." And so there was a pilot that flew the wrong way, and a football player who ran the wrong way. And we just need to make sure, ladies and gentlemen, that we're not Christians walking in the wrong way. And so tonight, if you're in this audience, you came into this building understanding that there's just some things that need to be made right between you and God. Now, maybe that's through the water of baptism and being able to rise to walk in newness of life, or maybe that's through coming home to your God. If you're a Christian and you've been taking some wrong steps and you've been going in a way that may seem right to you, maybe it's just because you want it to be right. You hope it's right because it's what you want to do, but you understand it's not really right with God. There'll never be a better time, better opportunity for you to come home to Him than right now. And so, if there's a public response you need to make to God tonight, and we can help you, we hope you'll let us. Let's stand and let's sing.